What if the world's most advanced and refined civilization, Rome, turned cruelty and death into its highest form of entertainment? The year was 80 AD, and the air shook with the thunderous roar of 50,000 voices, a storm of sound that rattled the marble foundations of the newly built Colosseum. Its gleaming stone walls reflected imperial power, vibrating with the promise of both magnificence and horror. On the arena floor stood a young Christian woman named Perpetua, shackled to a wooden post. Her eyes carried both defiance and fear. She had been condemned not for a crime but for a faith the empire considered dangerous. As the gates groaned open and a starving lion emerged, her fate was sealed before the crowd's eyes. This was no simple execution, it was theater, a spectacle personally promised by Emperor Titus. He had vowed to deliver 100 days of the most grotesque entertainments Rome had ever seen. These were no mere punishments. They were choreographed tragedies, crafted to enthrall, terrify, and keep the masses spellbound. Death in Rome was no longer a solemn event. It was staged like art. What began as gladiatorial combat had transformed into something far darker, as Romans pushed the boundaries of what could be considered spectacle and suffering. From this mix of imperial ambition and public appetite, the cruelest and most inhumane arena spectacles were born. They stained the empire's legacy with blood, revealing a civilization that boasted of greatness while sinking into a moral abyss. Over the next century, the shows grew even more depraved. Emperors, senators, and common citizens all reveled in the perverse thrill of watching human lives reduced to pawns, sacrificed for sport. But what did it say about a society when this became entertainment? What did it reveal about power, cruelty, and the role of violence in keeping an empire intact? The earliest of these spectacles were the naumachia, staged naval battles in the very heart of Rome. They were conceived by Julius Caesar himself. In 52 BC, Caesar ordered the creation of an artificial lake to host a mock war between Egyptian and Tyrian forces. The result was nothing short of nightmarish. 2,000 prisoners of war, 400 sailors, and 2,000 rowers were forced onto real warships to fight a bloody sham battle. The waters quickly ran red as men slaughtered each other or drowned beneath the crashing waves. As ships splintered and bodies floated, the crowd roared with delight, cheering over the carnage as if it were a play. Under Emperor Claudius, the naumachia reached new levels of sadism. In 52 AD, he staged a battle on Lake Fucino with 19,000 combatants. Bronze rams tipped the ships, and real weapons, spears, swords, and bows, ensured the fight was not an act but a massacre. Survivors of sinking ships were left to drown, or were hunted down by rival crews. To intensify the terror, shark-infested waters were introduced. The crowd gasped as survivors were dragged under, devoured by the beasts below. Chroniclers described the scene as a cauldron of screams, blood, and broken wood. The lake became littered with corpses and shattered vessels, the dead left to rot as a gruesome reminder of Rome's boundless appetite for cruelty. For citizens, it was proof of imperial dominance. For the empire, it was a demonstration that no other power could rival Rome's ability to wield death as spectacle. Yet, as horrifying as the naumachia were, they were only the beginning of a relentless parade of grotesque entertainments. The next stage was the venations, beast hunts where predator and prey roles were twisted into sadistic theater. Under Emperor Domitian in 81 AD came one of the most infamous displays, the Day of the Dwarfs. Men and women with dwarfism were forced into combat against each other, denied any chance of escape as the crowd jeered. Domitian's cruelty escalated further when he ordered pregnant women into the arena, where wild beasts were released upon them under the pretense of witnessing birth through death. But the venations descended into even darker territory under Caligula, whose reign in 39 AD became a showcase of disturbed imagination. He commanded that prisoners be dressed in animal skins, forced onto all fours and set upon by hunting dogs trained to kill. His most grotesque invention, however, was the mirror hunt. Enormous bronze mirrors were placed around the arena so that the condemned would see their own reflections multiplied as they faced death. Not only were they hunted, they were forced to watch themselves die. This perverse theater fascinated both emperor and citizen alike. Suffering itself had become art, carefully staged for maximum effect. Nero took this obsession further. After the Great Fire of Rome in 64 AD, he blamed Christians and made them his victims. Bound in animal skins, they were thrown to dogs and lions. But at night, the horror grew even more shocking. Nero ordered Christians dipped in pitch, set ablaze, and used as human torches to light his arenas. The audience watched as human bodies burned. Their suffering turned into a grotesque lantern show. These performances were spectacles of cruelty on a scale almost unimaginable, crafted from the agony of the empire's most vulnerable. As time passed, the shows grew in size, complexity, and barbarity. But what did it reveal about a society when such savagery was celebrated? What did it say about rulers who found glory in blood and citizens who found joy in suffering? What began as imperial displays of power twisted into a grotesque obsession. Arenas like the Colosseum were no longer places for gladiatorial duels alone. They became laboratories of cruelty, testing the limits of human endurance and imagination. For Rome, the blood of prisoners, slaves, and even citizens was no longer enough. The crowd demanded more, and emperors, desperate for control and applause, eagerly delivered. The evolution of these spectacles did not stop with animal hunts or naval massacres. As rulers sought to outdo their predecessors, the very concept of humanity in Rome was warped. Entertainment blurred with psychological torment, turning cruelty into a perfected art, an art designed not only to kill, but to break the human spirit in the name of power and spectacle. Spectacle was no longer just about killing. It became about bending the human spirit until it broke, pushing victims to the furthest edges of fear, humiliation, and agony. The third stage of Roman cruelty came with the rise of special gladiators, individuals forced into contests that mocked the very idea of fairness. Unlike traditional duels where two trained fighters might test skill and strength, these new displays were engineered to ensure one side had no chance of survival. Combatants were chosen from prisoners, slaves, and criminals, shoved into hopeless battles against overwhelming odds. These fights were not about honor. They were crafted to guarantee maximum suffering and entertainment. In 72 AD, Emperor Vespasian unveiled a chilling new category, the impossible gladiators. These contests weren't about skill. They were about humiliation, torment, and slow death. One notorious example saw a blind gladiator, his sight lost in a previous fight, forced to battle 12 children armed with dull knives. The image of a once feared warrior reduced to swiping blindly while children stabbed clumsily was deliberate degradation. He was doomed from the start. It was no contest. It was a staged slaughter, a cruel parody stretched out to wring every drop of despair from both fighter and crowd. But the cruelty did not end with unfair odds. A darker layer was added: psychological warfare. Gladiators were sometimes chained together at the ankle, forced to fight with that restriction. This was no minor handicap. It was a methodical way to prolong suffering. They could not flee, could not maneuver, trapped in a dance of exhaustion where survival was a cruel illusion. Every strike, every dodge was hampered by the chain, reminding them that escape was impossible. As these contests grew more elaborate, the focus shifted from mere violence to a grotesque form of body horror. During Emperor Commodus's reign in 186 AD, a new nightmare emerged: the metamorphosis gladiators. These men were forced to fight under progressively worsening conditions. After each wound, a limb would be amputated by surgeons, the bleeding hastily bound so the show could continue. A gladiator might enter the arena whole only to be reduced piece by piece to a limbless stump still forced to resist. The crowd watched, spellbound, as proud warriors were dismantled into broken shells, each gasp of pain another act in the theater of suffering. The horror went beyond physical destruction. It shattered the mind. These men weren't only fighting for survival, they fought to cling to the fragile illusion of hope. To prolong the torment, crude stimulants were administered, keeping them awake and conscious even after catastrophic injuries. They fought on when they should already have died. This allowed the audience to witness the entire descent, from first wound to inevitable collapse. Some of these agonies lasted for hours. Blood pooled across the sand, screams bounced from the stone walls, and spectators leaned forward, transfixed, waiting for the exact moment when strength gave out and the body crumbled. The deaths were slow, the agony prolonged, and that was precisely the point. The show was not about combat. It was about domination, stripping away dignity, strength, and finally humanity, until the gladiator became nothing more than a vessel of suffering. The crowd's reaction, a feverish mix of horror, fascination, and excitement, spoke volumes about the twisted psychology of Roman entertainment. It was never enough for gladiators to fight. They had to suffer. They had to break. Only then did they satisfy the masses. Yet Rome's obsession with cruelty did not stop at gladiatorial combat. The brutality escalated further through damnatio ad bestias, execution by wild beasts. This punishment was designed as spectacle as much as justice, but in 89 AD, Emperor Domitian transformed it into something even darker: the progressive executions. It became a theater of terror where death was not immediate but drawn out in calculated stages. The condemned first watched, others torn apart before their eyes. Then, in a final twist of sadism, they were forced to choose their own fate, selecting which animal would be the one to kill them. The very act of choosing became psychological torture, a moment where hope and dread collided under the gaze of a bloodthirsty crowd. But mercy had no place in this cruel design. The condemned were offered a deceptive promise: survival if they endured a series of encounters with ever more dangerous beasts. It was nothing but a staged illusion of hope, a sinister trick meant to prolong agony, to shatter spirit before life itself was taken. The first trial might pit them against a wounded herbivore, slow and harmless. Next came a small predator, and finally the inevitable climax: lion, tiger, or bear. By then the victims were already broken, weakened by exhaustion, hunger, and the crushing certainty of doom. They never truly had a chance. Yet that faint flicker of hope, dangling just out of reach, made their torment even sharper. The horror lay not only in claws and teeth, but in the slow psychological torture of knowing what awaited. Every moment dragged them closer to death in a deliberate, merciless rhythm. The darkest truth of these spectacles was not only the violence itself, but what it revealed about Rome. The ruling elite had grown so desensitized that cruelty was no longer seen as cruelty. It was culture. Executions and hunts became ritual, each act a display of the emperor's might, a warning that no one, no matter how powerful, could escape the grip of Rome. The arena became the empire in miniature, an unstoppable machine fueled by suffering, devouring lives without pause. And so the questions echo: what kind of society embraces such horrors? What does it say about power when human pain becomes entertainment? What does it reveal about us when domination outweighs compassion? We recoil at Rome's barbarity, but are we truly different? In an age still driven by spectacles and domination, how far would we go for power, control, or entertainment? By the end of the 1st century AD, Rome's appetite for cruelty had escalated into ever more inventive forms of torment. The arena was no longer just a killing ground. It had become a laboratory of psychological torture, a place where the human mind itself was dissected through orchestrated fear. One of the most disturbing evolutions was the rise of the theater of death, executions staged like grand dramas, blurring the line between legend and reality. These performances did not simply kill the condemned, they twisted their deaths into grotesque plays, forcing victims to reenact myths once meant to teach heroism and tragedy. But here every tale ended not in triumph but in unspeakable agony. In 83 AD, under Emperor Domitian, one of the most infamous of these spectacles unfolded. The myth of Orpheus, the musician who could charm wild beasts with his lyre, was chosen for reenactment. But in the Colosseum, the tale was warped beyond recognition. A young Christian poet, pulled from the ranks of the condemned, was forced into the role. He sang to the beasts as they entered, his music eerily commanding their movements as if the myth itself had come alive. For a fleeting moment the illusion worked. The crowd hushed in awe. But then came the climax. A pack of starved lions was unleashed. Unlike the mythical creatures tamed by Orpheus, these beasts obeyed no song. The lyre's melody was drowned beneath growls and screams as the lions tore into the poet, his body ripped apart before the transfixed audience. This was not myth. This was Rome's statement, that hope was meaningless, that even legend could not defy the will of the empire. The message was clear. No man, no story, no god could stand against Rome's power. What made it most chilling, however, was the people's response. The audience no longer recoiled. They revered it. To the citizens of Rome, the arena itself had become sacred ground, not because of life, but because of death. It was a temple to cruelty, where human suffering was not tragedy but ritual. By now, bloodshed had become woven into the very fabric of Roman life, death itself reduced to a daily spectacle. The fact that crowds could watch, cheer, and revel without the slightest moral pause was a chilling sign of just how far Rome had fallen into the abyss of dehumanization. As Rome's empire expanded, so too did the scale of its cruelty. Under Emperor Trajan, reigning from 98 to 117 AD, the empire staged some of the most elaborate displays of terror ever seen. In 103 AD, during celebrations of his victory in Dacia, he orchestrated a particularly gruesome execution based on the myth of Prometheus. The prisoner chosen to play the role was shackled to a rock at the arena's center. According to the myth, Prometheus was doomed to have his liver torn apart by an eagle for eternity. But the Romans twisted myth into nightmare. Surgeons cut open the victim's stomach so the bird could claw at his exposed organs in front of a screaming audience. Every cry of agony was drowned by cheers, each tear of flesh a spectacle to feed the people's thirst for cruelty. This was no longer mythic punishment. It was Rome showing it had the power to dominate life itself. But cruelty never stagnated. It escalated. By the time of Emperor Caracalla in the early 3rd century AD, executions had become even more personal. He introduced the familia damnatae, family executions. Entire households were condemned together, forced to watch their loved ones slaughtered in sequence. Children first, parents last. Each death inflicted maximum psychological torment before the blade fell on the survivors. For the crowd, it became a twisted form of voyeuristic entertainment. At this stage, Rome had abandoned even the pretense of celebrating bravery or skill. What had once been games of courage devolved into rituals of humiliation, torture, and despair. The arena no longer honored life, it erased it. The empire that once prided itself on law, order, and civilization had normalized cruelty so deeply that it became an institution. And the tragedy was not that it happened in secret. It happened openly in front of tens of thousands, cheered on by a society that prided itself on culture and progress. Gladiators, prisoners, Christians, and innocents alike were no longer seen as people. They became symbols, sacrifices to an empire that fed itself on suffering. Rome had turned death into an art form, and in doing so, stripped away the very humanity it once claimed to uphold. But perhaps the most unsettling truth is what this reveals about human nature itself. The same Romans who marveled at their libraries, aqueducts, and laws also gloried in blood. They called themselves civilized even as they clapped for carnage. That dissonance between sophistication and savagery reflects the darkest capacity within us all. It is easy, from the safety of modern times, to condemn the Romans as savages. But can we truly say we are different? Violence still dominates our media. Spectacle still thrives in our politics and culture. We still consume the suffering of others for our own entertainment. The Roman arena is not just history, it is a mirror. It warns us how quickly morality can collapse when cruelty is normalized, when power and profit outweigh compassion. Rome's descent into a theater of blood is not just their story, it is a warning for ours. The measure of civilization is not in conquest, but in compassion. Rome forgot that. The question is, will we?